to the panel, and it's been chaired by Manto, one of my colleagues in the Department of Management, and we thank Ola for putting this event together. So our task is to engage with current debates. So in this panel, we have theory and practice on digital transformation, looking at some of the impacts and some of the risks associated with it. So that's all from me. I'm going to hand over to Manto, who will be chairing the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen and Orla for organizing us, and to Riccardo for putting the panel together. I'd like to welcome you as well to this impact event, and really welcome the debate on this topical issue. I'm Manto Gotsi. I'm a senior lecturer in marketing at the Department of Management here at Birkbeck. My own research is in paradoxes, so I think this topic of kind of mapping the impact of digital transformation, which is something that clearly has great efficiency gains for public and private sector organizations, yet has considerable challenges and risks, is something that I find very fascinating. So I'm really looking forward to the debate. Without further ado, the idea is that we're going to have presentations from Jos, Riccardo, Maria, and Hayfa. Hopefully you've had a look at their bios. We've got a very interesting panel today. And then after the presentations, we're actually going to be opening it up for Q&A. Jos Entsminger is our first panel member. He's a PhD researcher in innovation and public policy at UCL, and has been involved in World Economic Forum reports in terms of sustainable production systems and global technology governance. So Jos, I'll let you take the floor with the first presentation.
Great, thank you. And apologies, I created some slides last minute as a way to make things a little bit easier for myself and everyone else. But first, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. All right, yes, thank you, and thank you for the warm introduction. Hi, I'm Jos Entsminger. I'm a doctoral candidate at UCL. And the presentation I'm about to give is part of a paper that was prepared for a university in Spain called Instituto de Empresa at a place called the Center for the Governance of Change, where I was requested to look at how public value is intersecting with the need and the desire, particularly within the European Union and within Spain, to create novel public sector artificial intelligence strategies. So for the briefest context for anyone unfamiliar with this field, the Joint Research Center for the European Union, which has a base in Sevilla, has been conducting quite a lot of research on the state of artificial intelligence in the public sector. And just within the last 2 years, they've noticed an explosion of offerings that they've been able to catalog, identify, and clarify. To just give you the numbers here kind of give this picture. So there was 143 in 2021, which was built off the 2022 survey, and then in or 2020 survey, and then in 2022 they jumped up to 680 solutions. These are solutions that are actively being deployed within the EU public sector or that are being considered for larger scale out. The index itself is coded through a specific kind of analysis, but it doesn't have any implications for the ethics of any of these given solutions. Just notes that something is going on such that the public sector is really, really interested in AI lately. Obviously, in the last 2 years, we've noticed a bit of an explosion of this trend due to COVID, where more and more public sector actors are looking for ways to mediate the relationship to citizens or to one another digitally, so as to both improve their ability to be resilient to future labor shocks, as well as to improve their overall efficiency, so to speak. But of course, it's important to say that investment in usage of AI by the public sector is nothing new, particularly in the context of the UK and the US. AI in the public sector goes back at least to the 1970s. So in terms of where it's being deployed and how to think about that, we get some basic breakdown in the JRC database. So quite a lot of the focus is on AI being used for information processing by external actors, so actors that are able to gain access to public sector and governmental data, and then provide an analytics service, and then send the insights and analytics back, or otherwise provide a direct tie-in to government operations. Otherwise, it's being used to assist kind of with the back end of these operations, for instance, with document processing automation. And quite a lot of this work you can see also within the context of the US in a report that was released in 2021, where, for instance, in the Office of Budgetary Management, there's quite a lot of interest in AI for financial reporting. But what's curious here is that AI is is pretty consistently used as a way for external actors to take over a specific action of the public sector, or to take over and augment a public sector service. Otherwise, it's being positioned as a way to displace the need for those services, or the need for those specific actors within the public sector to exist, often through specific kinds of automation. So you literally remove kind of the need or the capacity for that position to be needed. And then in some cases, but it's unclear in terms of the total distribution, how much this is the priority to augment the public sector's capability to deliver and improve its own services. And so what's kind of different beyond COVID, particularly in the last 2 to 3 years, is that there's a massive and growing GovTech and public tech development space, where you're getting quite a lot of interest in investment from private sector actors and venture capital into what are the kinds of services that we can sell through procurement contracts to the public sector, and how do we introduce a new generation of entrepreneurs that may be able to compete with the larger players that have been kind of pretty well established in this space, but who are willing to take on kind of the long-term procurement contracts. And then you have kind of this long-running trend of increasing digital transformation. Particularly in the UK, we've seen this accelerated heavily since 2010 with the introduction of the government digital service. But in other areas, this is a even further longer-running trend over 20, 30 years. But where this leads us in terms of the theory, in terms of the established literature, is that GovTech and digital transformation are not neutral activities. Instead, the function that they perform for government and the public sector, and therefore for citizens, depends on the model of the public administration that's being transformed. And so all of this kind of reinforces this specific point. If we want to think about what the implications of AI in the public sector are, you need to know, well, what is your model of the public sector overall? What's your theory of the public sector? What do you think the role of the state is? Within the transatlantic, and again, predominantly being seen within the UK and the US, as well as being seen within the major Central European countries, is this theory of a public administration called New Public Management. And this derives pretty heavily from the idea of public choice. And if you want to be able to understand this, or if this is your first introduction to this, there's 2 basic abiding hypotheses on which this model of the public sector relies. The first is that a state's action in the economy has a necessary but insufficient condition of a market failure. So if there's monopoly or anti-competitive behavior, or if there's a public goods problem, that's good to be able to know, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the state is the best actor to be able to take care of it. But most importantly, it means that that's the only time when the state has any legitimate avenue for pursuing something. So all the other things that a state does and performs in terms of welfare and addition are not necessarily legitimate or justified, and have been reduced or augmented pretty considerably, and very clearly within the US and the UK. And the second is that the risk of government failure, or that if the government gives a grant which allows for a specific firm to gain a rent extracting position where no one else can compete with them, or otherwise if the public sector deploys a solution that has some massive considerable social negative impact, and you combine this model with public failure, the conclusion you get is that the public sector overall needs to be reduced and minimized and eliminated, because that's how you both reduce the possibility of government failure, and also, well, if the state has no real legitimate role outside of market failures, why would you need it? And can we just outsource everything else to the private sector? this becomes the problem. And this becomes the overarching thesis of the paper, and this becomes quite a lot of the work that is being conducted at the institute where I'm housed, the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, where, to put it simply, if you deploy AI in new public management contexts, you're going to get new public management solutions. So if you deploy AI in a context where the role of the state is unnecessary, you're going to get solutions which reinforce that vision and which tend to push that model of the state out, or tend to push the model of the state as providing any other services out. The more concerted version of this would be, if you build AI for neoliberal administrations, you'll get solutions which reinforce the neoliberal vision. So in other terms, to put it a little bit more kind of like broadly, the context of demand and employment for a given AI solution shapes which kind of solutions are incentivized to be developed and used. And this is seen very clearly in the context of GovTech offerings. And then pushing this even further, the kind of public administration shapes which kinds of AI solutions are selected, not which are created. So there's a wide market of AI solutions which are being created and proposed and innovated, but the specific ones which are being relied on for actual activity are giving a bit of a worrying trend, which reinforces the idea that new public management is the abiding ethos for AI deployment currently. And so how should we think about this in terms of concerns? And apologies if I'm going over time, please let me know. I position it at the theoretical level that there's a concern that, all right, if new public management is this ethos that the state needs to be reduced, and then AI deployed in new public management context is going to reinforce that vision, what does that actually mean? Ultimately, what this means is AI becomes a means for outsourcing and privatizing state activity, or becomes an easier avenue for outsourcing and privatizing state activity. This secondarily means that there's an increasing role for external consulting firms to be able to take over some of the agenda, to be able to position what and how should AI be used by virtue of the existing lack of public sector capacity to understand and use AI, independent of whether or not AI is actually contributing to public service provision. And this is being seen, for instance, in countries like the UAE. You have the secondary and a little bit, not necessarily more worrying, but very worrying trend that the more that you pursue automation, the more that you pursue this outsourcing, the more that you're reducing the long-term capacity of the state to respond to and adjust to new challenges. And by extension, if you reduce that capacity, you're reducing their long-term legitimacy to be able to act in any effective way. And this capacity legitimacy question has been heavily written about by one of my colleagues, Rosie Collington, and I can post her paper later. And then, if AI overall is just helping facilitate outsourcing, then there's the question that if you leverage AI specifically for automation functions, then it's not just that you're outsourcing some of the public sector activities, but you're displacing the actual positions within the public sector that would be able to adjust and respond and understand what's going on within a given ministry, and then using that as a way for external actors to actually take on even more role for the public sector. And the latter two become a little bit more clearly of the stakes, which is you have increasing inequity of potential service provision, or you increase inequality through service provision. The latter one being seen most clearly in the CIRI case in the Netherlands, where AI was used faultily in welfare claims. The second concern is where the theory takes over a little bit further, though. And this is the reality that AI development and use is not happening in a political vacuum, nor in an economic vacuum. But the reality is that quite a lot of the tools and functionality of AI are being heavily developed and incentivized and funded by a few of the major technology firms, which themselves are coming under a considerable amount of regulatory scrutiny for the role in anti-competitive market activities, their fines for specific rights violations, and their positioning around creating rent-extractive business models, where their ability to, for instance, gain advantages in terms of a profit maximization are heavily built on their ability to maintain and secure capacities within AI deployment. So you see this particularly in the context of Amazon, Meta, and Alphabet. And the reality then further becomes, okay, if AI is involved in this external political economy, ultimately this means that the public sector itself is involving itself in this extractive digital economy without necessarily addressing that anti-competitive side and potentially implicating itself further through procurement and grants in accelerating the worst features of this external economy. And this leads us to, and this is almost the end of the presentation, what might provide an alternative? If one of the biggest sources of this issue is the fact that our vision of the public sector is, well, it's unnecessary except by virtue of like specific subservices in specific limited areas. What if there's an alternative vision of the public sector which reinforces the idea that actually quite a lot of the work that we see in the private sector wouldn't exist in the way that it does without other public sector activity? And so what we get is the theory of public value creation. And so there's three theories to consider. One's from Harvard in 1995, another one's from ASU with Barry Bozeman in 2007, and then another one's from my institute in 2020. Essentially what they position is, if new public management is about asking how can a state get out of the way of value and wealth creation, these theories try to position how can the relationship between the public and private sector better facilitate wealth and value creation while producing the goods, services, and environments which a society demands. And so just because, for instance, that a market demands, or that there's a potential for the market for kidneys, does not mean that if there was a market for kidneys, that would actually produce a more socially beneficial outcome. That there are some things for which market mechanisms fail, and by extension, we need alternative measurements of value, and in which case, the ability to subsume everything in the idea that the market can provide all necessary services in the most efficient way collapses. And if you take that argument seriously, you get a completely different theory of how the state and the economy relate, and by extension, what we should think about when we think about the role of AI in a given society. And in the latter side, in terms of state legitimacy, again, you get this push away from the whole role of the state just to address market failures. And so, how can you use AI to address anti-competitive behavior within AI firms? And instead you get to, again, if there's something about value which is underdetermined by how markets work, or at least by how prices allocate goods efficiently, then we need to push from market failure to understanding public value failures, which is when actors in society fail in the creation of the normative goods demanded in that society. So what are the values that we actually want? But you may be thinking, all right, this just means we need to reinforce the ethical side, and this is my plea. The ultimate end of this is that public value is not ethics. Rather, public value is the use of ethics to shape the specific relationship between public and private actors in the organization, creation, distribution of the normative goods demanded in the society. Ethical frameworks help us to elucidate, identify, and clarify responsibility in the creation of some of these goods, as well as specific features. But the ability to produce and create them and maintain them is outside the remit of the classic action within ethical theory and ethical advisory work. And ultimately, where this positions is that while we need a massive push in the AI ethics movement, towards what features of public sector solutions need to be pushed, how they need to be assessed. This is not the entirety of the game, and this may not be the biggest game that we need to be watching. But this is also not a plea to say public value is perfect, unerring, and otherwise, well, the best replacement for any other rationale. But what public value gives us most and most clearly is simply a different way of thinking about the role of the state, and by extension, a different way of thinking about how AI and the state can interact and intersect. And so it gives us this different idea of the role of the state, this different idea of long-term state capabilities being, how do you improve the ability for the public sector, for instance, to improve welfare provision over time? And does that ability to improve welfare provision over time increase the more that you outsource? The ultimate answer being no. It changes a perspective on the source of legitimacy for state activity. Again, if the role of the state is just market failure, then you can minimize the state and there's no worry. However, if there is an essential role of the state in public value creation that we've seen historically, then outsourcing, automating otherwise may collapse its ability to provide and influence positively public value creation. But this isn't to say that the state is the only actor, that public value necessarily means that it's the public sector creating value. Instead, public value, again, is just what are the things that we as a society demand, and are they being provided? And so where this ends, and this is where I'll cap off the presentation, is ultimately the most immediate end of this is public value makes us need to be mindful about how and when AI positions the public sector towards outsourcing, towards privatization, and involvement in an extractive political economy of digitalization. And if we pay attention to this, we can potentially produce different solutions, as well as identify how and when AI may be reinforcing some structurally large negative outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Josh, and thanks for getting the debate going in terms of kind of different theoretical perspectives with regard to the phenomenon that we are discussing today. I'll now leave the floor to Riccardo Zechinelli, who will give us, I guess, a hands-on approach from the kind of running of the UK government and the government automation task force and his experience, and the adoption of AI technologies across the public sector. So Riccardo, I'm gonna leave the floor to you.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks to Josh. Was a fascinating one. So associated just to what you say, previous presentation was mentioning increased use of digital transformation, and also the consideration of public values, inequalities. So I think somehow I will try to touch some of these topics also here. So my presentation basically is based on a new framework that we co-developed with some researchers from Rome Tor Vergata University, and that is part of a paper. The researchers are Andrea Bonomi, Fabiana Scalabrini, and Lorenzo Costomato. This new framework basically is a way to help public managers and policymakers to better understand the potential effects of digital transformation on a public sector organization, especially when there is a lack of data and evidence. This, unfortunately, is most of the times. It's important to flag since the beginning that for digital transformation, what do we mean is the uptake of digital technology, including AI, but also cloud, any kind of automation technology, and so on. So if we move to the next slide. Yes, so from the left side, basically try just to put in graphs challenges, let's say, from a policymaker and public manager perspective. The first one is really a bit of a lack of understanding of what could be the potential effects of such technologies. At the moment, there is not really a clear roadmap, and secondly, there is especially a lack of data and evidence to really understand what is the problem that could resolve the technology, and what are the potential data to better estimate the impact on the public value, if you like, of new technologies. So what happens is that most of the times policymakers, they fall on this availability heuristic. So they take decisions based on what decision they took in the past. What you see is what it is, while actually should be considered more and more to create new data, to have more evidence-driven decisions. On the right side, basically, it's just an illustration of what is going on more recently. Like, for example, government digital services is using experimentation, pilots, prototypes to get more information. So feedback on how good is the impact of the technology, and to really understand a bit more the kind of causal chain from the impact of this technology. So if we move to next slide, basically all these virtuous experiments of using pilots to get some initial data on the impact of digital technology, we can consider as a kind of bottom-up experimentation. This is very good, but still is very rare used by public sector organizations to understand the impact of technologies. And secondly, what happens with this kind of bottom-up experimentation is that they tend to focus especially on a niche of the impact. So if you like, this is like a tree branch that is very specific to try to understand the impact, but it captures only some specific element. On the other hand, we can have, if we zoom out, we can see the tree from the top. Maybe we don't have really all the pixels right. It's a kind of top-down mapping, but it's more complete, even if it's less precise. And this is what we are trying to do here with our top-down framework. So if we move to the next one. So in developing this new theoretical framework, basically, first of all, was an exercise to really crystallize, okay, what is out there that we know, what are the potential, let's say, mechanical consequences once you integrate a digital technology in a production function of a public sector organization. So we have key channels that we select at this stage, like in terms of automation, replacement of some of the factors, augmentation, so being complementary to these production factors, and productivity, a metrics to try to capture how you can produce more with less inputs. A second element useful to apply such framework and understand the impact of technologies is to understand, okay, about what part of a public sector organization could impact. And to do that, basically, we interpret public sector organization as normal organization where a mix of inputs produce the output, where labor workforce is one of these inputs, producing public services, value. This is quite tricky, as also Josh said, there are different ways on how you can measure public value. At this stage, also for sake of illustration, we use, let's say, a cost accounting approach to identify the value of public services and the labor. But basically, our framework is going to focus especially on the automation. You can see the red rectangle, and especially the impact on the two elements, the inputs, the workforce, and the output, the value of the public services. So if we go to the next one, please. Yes. Once identify, let's say, the potential theoretical channel of impact and on what part of the public sector could actually impact, we crystallize really the key metrics from literature to understand what are really the key bottlenecks that need to be considered when you try to estimate the probability that some service or workforce could be substituted due to an uptake of digital technology. And these are the three key metrics that we observe in literature. These are especially social intelligence. So more social intelligence is important, more critical intelligence like originality, the ability of caring, of working together, and the dexterity is a third element. More is intense the use of this specific type of bottleneck, more will be difficult for digital technology to actually automate straight away workforce and services. And based on these metrics, we could actually calculate, let's say, an automation indicator that we're going later to use to size the value of the substitution effect. So moving to the next one. So once we identify, let's say, the theoretical output of our work, we want to apply this to reality. We use as a case study the Italian public sector. And we focus first on over 60 types of public services in the Italian public sector, and later we will move to Italian professions. But basically, using these metrics, we interview a pool of experts saying, okay, what do you think could be the probability of automation of these different services? Once you consider the services really as a basket of processes, so different processes really have different likelihood of substitution. This allowed to basically map out the different Italian public services, yes. And we could identify what are the most likely to be automated and also rank, if you like, the value of substitution of the services. Not surprisingly, you can see that the highest value of substitution comes from those services that tend to be more repetitive with the low dexterity and the cognitive intensity, like the copy of judicial document or administrative office, etc., things like that. If we move to the next slide, basically we can see the second approach, rather than to look at the impact of digital transformation automation effect on the output on the public services. We look at one of the main inputs. So let's see what's going on if we apply this to workforce. And similarly, based on experts' estimate using our metrics and considering jobs really as a compilation of different tasks, where each task is more or less likely. So, for example, a job can have different tasks, can have problem solving, can use more or less team working, dexterity, communication, and so on. Based on all of this mix of things, we were able to map out over 100 different types of professions, what were most likely or not to be automated with an uptake of digital technology. You can see on the top left the ones that are potentially most likely to be automated. And similarly, we could also identify the value of substitution. So at this stage, before moving to the following slide, I think it's very important that somehow our framework can tend to be, as far as possible, if you like, neutral. So not necessarily this is positive or negative, but this is simply a kind of mechanical substitution effect that could happen. If we move to the next slide, we are going to see actually some of the potential, let's say, risk. So the previous slide could be considered as well from a kind of potential risk of unemployment in the worst case scenario, when jobs have really high level of task that could be substituted. Using this automation indicator and the salary of the different profession, our initial analysis show a negative relationship. This, of course, needs to further examine it, but I think it gives some initial thoughts for policymakers. And yes, wrapping up, conscious of time, last slide. So what we have done here, we try to develop a new top-down framework that, even if cannot be very precise, capture all the diversity of the different organizations, trying to give a tool to public managers and policymakers to attempt a mapping of the impacts and risk of from an uptake of digital technology. This particularly is important in the concept of anticipatory governance, using a mix of methodology to triangulate and develop a better and more targeted policy. So think about how this, for example, framework could be used to identify higher risk of return or higher risk area with a higher risk of risk. And also could be potentially useful for policymakers to test the case for potential impact on income inequality. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Riccardo. This is really interesting research, both in terms of kind of potential impact on jobs, but also, as you said, in terms of income distribution, equality, and so forth. Thank you very much. We'll now invite Maria Axente to take the floor. Maria is responsible AI lead at PwC, and I guess she drives the implementation of AI with this kind of responsible angle. So really looking forward to your presentation, Maria.
Thank you very much, Manto, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope you keep well and hydrated on this heat. Thank you, Josh and Riccardo, for your interesting research. My lightning talk, it's going to be a bit different, obviously. I'm not a researcher, I'm a practitioner. I've spent the last 5 years working with my colleagues and our clients and understand how to deploy AI that it considers both its benefits, its potential risk, but also its unique nature, to the extent that AI has is a non-deterministic technology that comes to clash with our way of doing things that's very linear and deterministic. And what I wanted to share with you today is few lessons that I believe that could be very useful in the public sector with its adoption of AI and potentially even wider with digital transformation. Very much supporting what George said in his presentation on the interest and investment in the sector. He was talking about public sector in AI. We have observed with in the COVID time, obviously the interest in investing in digital transformation has increased dramatically, because many executives have understood that with the view of external pressure, organizations need to find any efficiency gains they could, and technology came very handy into solving these efficiency dilemmas. And we've seen budgets increase allocated to AI, more AI proof of concept and experimentation moving into development, deploy, and also high level of interest of working with third party, acquiring AI application for multiple functional area within the value chain, which prompted the idea that there has to be some sort of managing, governing those AI application that seems to be being used across the value chain in a more distributed way that we have been used with previous technology. Hence, a pressure and an expectation for AI to be managed responsibly. Implementing AI with my colleagues for our clients in a way that acknowledges or balance risk with benefits, we understood that sometimes we need to go back to the basic, and this is where the first key learnings comes about. There's a lot of conversation about AI and a lot of attempts to define it in various circles, but the reality is when it comes to solving a problem, it doesn't matter as much on how to define AI. It matters for you to be able to say, this is my problem, and I'm gonna find a solution that comprises both from human intelligence and skills and machine intelligence. Many of our clients are a bit shy to say, oh, we don't really care as much if you label it AI or not. I have a problem that requires you to use machine learning or voice assistant or optimization in order for me to solve this problem that has such a profound impact on how I operate as a business. So the first rule is to be precise as what is the exact problem you're trying to solve and what sort of a solution you assemble that is a combination of various technology we tend to label as AI, but also human ingenuity. The second key learning was to understand that the current operating models most of our clients deploy is not only linear in nature, but also it's formed of silos that rarely communicate with each other. But AI requires much more collaboration in between various departments with the view of understanding the impact, not the immediate impact on user, but the wider impact a technology, a stochastic technology like AI would have on processes, on people, how people perform their jobs, what sort of a performance that entity aspire to, and how AI is able to support achieving those goals. So having this understanding that the new way of thinking of governing AI is required, and that will trigger most likely a transformational change, because organization or internal teams will have to talk to each other. We'll have to learn to collaborate. We'll have to learn to exchange information, and that's not always easy. And also that comes on top of their existing responsibilities. And the big question comes is, how do we ensure that the new governance that AI requires will it's going to happen in practice, and what sort of incentive structure we need to have available so that people will embrace these new ways of working. A third lesson is obviously about the team. Traditionally, the development of software was left to the mercy. No, it's a harsh word, of the technologies. But in the end, there was little interaction with any other type of experts that would have a word to say in how technology is being developed. And what we have observed increasingly with our clients and ourselves is this enlargement of the development team, going into relying heavily on data scientists, bringing together all sorts of engineers, data, machine learning engineers, but also increasingly legal scholars, ethicists, but also case by case project, use case by use case, engaging different type of scientists, human psychologists, social scientists, with a view of expanding the understanding and knowledge of the existing and specific use case. And this particular development is exciting, is because for a while we have been promoting a new framing of AI that moves away from AI being solely a general purpose technology into acknowledging that AI is a socio-technical system that require a consideration of the context where AI is being developed and used. And this particular learning and this particular development of enlarging the development team confirms that more and more where AI is being developed and used, there's an understanding of the importance of the context, the organizational context, the cultural context, the legal context, and taking those constraints sometimes into account when developing AI. The fourth lesson is about risk. We have learned that AI is bringing new risk that needs to be managed accordingly. And most of the organization, except for those who have a strong risk management maturity, discipline and maturity, is to say that managing risk needs to come at the same level with developing AI. Risk management needs to be seen as business as usual, rather than activity you perform at the end of the project or somewhere in isolation being done by compliance. Most of those risks, if you look at the ICO Data and AI Risk Toolkit they have just issued earlier this year, says that AI risks are different in nature. Some of them could be addressed with technical interventions. Other are more governance process led in nature. Other are more strategic in nature. So therefore, it needs to be understanding of all possible risks that a specific application will trigger in its context, and being able to have this holistic approaches. How do we manage it? Who's responsible of managing those risks? And how well are we prepared to manage this all long term as we go? And lastly, the most important probably lesson is that we need to consider the values. We've heard so much being said about the ethics of AI and how it doesn't really seems to be demonstrate its impact. But I would say that operationalizing ethics in a specific context is almost like planting a seed. You can't expect a tree to grow overnight. It takes time for that tree to grow, to make fruits. So besides taking the necessary time to be able to see the value of embedding ethics in specific AI application, we also need to be transparent and need to be collaborative, and also acknowledge that embedding ethics is not a one-off. It doesn't happen happen only one stage in a process. We are not only ethical or consider ethical analysis and reflection at the beginning of the project. It's something that should happen continuously in multiple stages of development, but also needs to be something that everyone involved in the development of AI is accountable for, not just a specific person, an ethicist or a responsible AI lead or anyone else that has that title. It's really important to strive for an ethical behavior of the collective, being the team, being the organization, also be the individuals. And the last thing I wanted to say is that those learning for us will continue, and we are delighted to be able to share it with different communities. And what public sector can do is assess those learnings and engage with industry to see how they can translate those learnings into action that are relevant for the adoption of AI in the public sector, done in a responsible and ethical manner. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. This is fascinating, and thank you for summarizing the key lessons. I'll now turn to Hayfa Mohdzaini, who's CIPD Senior Research Advisor in Data Technology and AI, and I'll leave the floor to you, Hayfa.
Thank you, Manto. I'll try and keep mine brief, being the last one. So I also come from a practitioner's point of view, specifically HR practitioners. So three key messages I want to share. Firstly is that we see AI or other technologies impacting jobs in more than just augmenting and just substituting work. We did a project recently with the Institute for the Future of Work. We've completed a guide on responsible investment in technology, and that part of the framework is to get people to think about the impact of substitution, augmentation, and also other types of impacts. And there are 6 actually according to Institute for the Future of Work. So another one is telepresence, like what we're doing at the moment, remote working, intensification, doing more things at the same time, transference, where you get that job transferred to someone else. So not just look at creation and elimination, but think in between as well. And each type of impact, regardless of what the technology is before that's causing it, thinking of the impacts, and we get people to think about what those questions are. So for example, intensification, we get people to think about, will the person be able to cope with the new speed of work? How will they be supported? Will they need training? Do they need tools, or do we need to reconsider the speed they need to be working in the future? So we've got sort of thinking points with people in our guide for different types of impact of technology. So first is that we recognize there's more than just augmentation and elimination. Secondly, also within the framework, we being responsible, as Maria very detailed explained about AI, thinking more generally about being responsible with technology, it's to consider the impact on your people, so the people who work for you and the people you serve. So in the public sector organization, the risk of going digital means that are you accidentally excluding certain parts of the population from accessing your services, especially those who really need work. For example, say if all the applications go online, are you preventing some people with no digital devices from accessing services? Similarly for employees, what's the impact on your people who are doing the work? Okay, so if you're eliminating the job, have you got a clear path for them to the next role, whether it's within the organization, outside? I find a lot, that organizations are pretty good at, planning next roles within the organization. But when it comes to, okay, we haven't got anything else to offer you in this organization, it just feels like, okay, the next step is just redundancy. And there's not a lot of coordination between organizations. So, hey, we've got, extra capacity here, we're looking for people. There's not a lot of collaboration outside. I see a lot of within, redeployment, training people ahead for future roles within the company, but thinking outside the organization, not a lot. One example I give you, for example, in Hilton Hotels during the pandemic, they obviously didn't have work for their staff, and they were very close to just, making them all redundant. This is in the States, and and just in time, if what they did was HR turned their recruitment pipeline upside down, saying, hey, look around at other organizations, so logistics, supermarkets, online businesses. They were looking for people at the time. So they worked with other organizations to create a preferred candidate path. So making it easy for the employees, not just leaving to the employees to sort out a job whilst they don't need them, but actually helping employees to find that next job for them. So if we can get more of this happening, it's only so much an organization can do. So if at from the sort of government level, policy level, if they can think more about how we can incentivize more cross collaboration between businesses, that would be awesome, because there's only so much an organization can do. And thirdly, it's on good people management practices, workforce planning. To summarize in 2 words, workforce planning. If you know that this tech is coming, it is for sure happening. This is how the future organization is going to look like. This is where HR can step in and say, okay, what's the new strategy? What do you want the new organization to look like? What skills do you need? And if it's a small organization, you can obviously do this on a spreadsheet, have a conversation with your managers. But actually, there is also tech out there, and some of it's actually built into HR information systems that enable you to do this kind of skills planning, skills gap analysis, skill planning kind of thing. So one example is a real estate company with tens of thousands of employees. They knew that the real estate industry is changing, and rather than wait till the last year or 2 when this is actually happening, just making people redundant, they're thinking ahead, saying, okay, we're going to define all the competencies in the company for now. What have we got now? We're going to define the future competencies required in the next 3 to 5 years, for example, and then we're going to see what the gap is, and we're going to support people through it. And because they've got tens of thousands of employees, they are using a software to help them map this for them, because it is a humongous job. You could probably do it on paper, but it's a humongous job. So they're using technology to help them to do that job. So 3 things, basically. So think about different ways technology can work beyond just eliminating, creating jobs. It's also intensification and channel presence and so on. Secondly, being responsible, thinking about the impact of your people. So, if you can provide them a clear path as to what their next role is within the company or outside the company and support them through it, that whole digital transformation doesn't feel so scary for them, and it also makes the public sector organizations more resilient. Weetabix, for example, makes it a point to talk to your trade unions on a regular basis about plans for organizations, so that when something happens to the company, jobs changing, roles changing, people getting redeployed, it's not a surprise for them, for the employees. And then thirdly, good management practice, workforce planning, workforce planning, workforce planning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The examples, I think, were very, very interesting and useful to provide also food for thought for us. Shall I open this up then for questions? I think you can raise your hand, your digital hand, or just unmute yourself, I guess, and shout out your question. Any questions from the audience? No? No questions? I'll start.
I see a hand up.
Oh, there is a hand. Sorry, I have a tiny screen on a laptop and I really can't see. Whoever it is, would you mind unmuting yourself?
Grazia, I'm Grazia Yetogeles. Here I am. That's him. That's me.
Hi,
Okay.
Grazia. Thank you very much. Yes.
Hi. I think all the presentations have been very, very interesting, and clearly they give us a little flavor of things to come. Now, I wonder whether any of you, the speakers, whether you have, in particular, I'd like to ask the first one, Joshua, whether any thought has been devoted to the bigger issues of what to do, with the productivity increases, which will come from substituting some of the jobs with the AI, with the digitalization, and B, what to do with the workforce released via this, the introduction of AI, and what will the future of society look like? What do we do with them? How is the public sector planning for a future in which there will be fewer people employed by it, but there is a lot of workforce available, and probably very well qualified. So what will the future look like? What do we do with them? Do we train them to start doing art? How do they use spare time, if they have any?
So I can try to add 30 seconds. So essentially, you've asked a dissertation of a question, and I've got about 30 seconds to be able to address it. The ultimate first position is nothing about what you said is guaranteed. Nothing about that is inevitable. In fact, that vision reinforces the idea that the primary function of AI is to augment and displace, and by virtue of that, we're going to have massive productivity gains, and we're going to see those gains in the short term, and what you're going to get from that is massive spillovers, where you have quite a lot of interest coming in and displacing those workers. But what that relies on is the idea that workers and capital are functionally interchangeable in a specific model, and that model being within a system where capital has disproportionate returns instead of labor. Rewards level to capital will accrue, and more people with access to capital will invest in the systems which allow for them to have a return on capital without having that appropriate return to labor, which reinforces the automation version. The research that we get from people like Darren Acemoglu essentially says that's not inevitable, and to begin from the assumption that it's inevitable is essentially where now we have to question. So that's the very short answer. The longer answer is I have no good answer to that, because that's not my area of study currently. But I can refer you to specific sources.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Grazia, for the question. Any further questions? May I ask just a couple of questions, please? I'll start with Riccardo, and I think what you're doing in terms of trying to identify, first of all, the probability of automation, but also kind of the implications on jobs and income, very, very useful. Could you elaborate a bit on what you see as the potential repercussions of the analysis that you've got in terms of the impact on income distribution, and what can we kind of learn from that, and what do you think should be the actions forward against that?
Yeah, thanks. I will be short, conscious of time. So I think the next steps for this work, our work, but more in general, I think is just to keep increasing the understanding. So Hayfa, for example, talk about, I think, 6 channels. There is no only augmentation, automation. So I think the challenge there is to really get a better understanding of the different channels. At the moment, for example, our framework consider only substitution. That, of course, is just a part of the reality. So really, the next steps to understand, for example, the impact on inequality or things like that, I think there is still a bit of work to capture the complementarity effect, all the other potential effects, and really to increase evidence. So yes, I think in terms of next steps, is just to go a bit more in depth and try to collect more evidence as possible, also on the other channels of impact.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Riccardo. And I'm conscious of time, but I thought maybe as kind of final questions, perhaps Hayfa and Maria. I mean, what you've been discussing in your presentations was this, I guess, this need, on the one hand, to kind of think about, you know, the problems, but also, I guess, innovation and you know, the need for cross-functional teams, breaking down silos, the how we can deal with the impacts on people. And I think, you know, since we're talking about the impact of public sector, what kind of fora, you know, how do you think that the learning that has taken place in public, in the private sector, sorry, how can the public sector actually learn from that? How is this transfer going to happen, basically, from your point of view?
Thank you, Manto. That's a very good question. It is something that I wouldn't have a straight answer. I would say that's case by case. At least here in the UK, we've seen the government being very keen to collaborate with the industry, but there's a little bit of a shyness from the industry perspective, because engagement takes time and needs to be purposeful and intentional. I would say that the model that works the best here in the UK is via the Tech Association, Technology Industry Association, Tech UK. They're able to assemble various working groups on different topics and being able to engage both the industry and public policy makers. That's, to me, a very useful way of engaging. But also, depending on each department and each strategic objective, it will be developing personal relationship. When I say personal relationship of each department with different players and different representatives of these players. Working for a company of the size of PwC's, we're saying that sometimes it's just funny that we are looking for our colleagues on LinkedIn. That we are so big that we resort of external means of finding each other. So it's really important to identify the right experts and establish a communication and collaboration. And also, there is a point of an incentive. So if industry is about to share those learnings, what will be gained? Because you know, in anywhere, I just want to highlight that it takes time to distill those learning, to share it. So therefore, is there something that the public sector can give in return in terms of learnings? Because ultimately, we are not here, and it's not here only for one party to share what they have learned. It should be a dialogue. It should be a collaboration between both parties, because there's much to learn from the other side in terms of the safety, in terms of managing complexity, in terms of working with different incentive structure than in the industry. So I think it's case by case, to recap and to summarize, and also resort to forums that already have a good reputation and track of bringing industry and public policy together and working towards common goals.
Thank you very much, Maria. Hayfa, do you have something to add in that respect?
I think Maria explained it beautifully. Yeah, I feel like it's not just public sector learn from private, it's both ways. And actually, you know, having listened to some examples, actually, you know, when they do digital transformation at organization scale, I've spoken to 2 organizations, and it is actually, they have cross-functional teams. They're already, I feel, quite advanced in this particular examples. Maybe they're not less advanced examples, in which case they could learn from elsewhere. So besides looking outside, I would say definitely look inside as well, and, you know, use the established employee channels to communicate with the people that matter. Thank you very much. Helen, I'm conscious of time. Should we wrap up the event? What do you think? I can't hear you. I think you are muted, Helen.
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. Yes. It's always frustrating that we don't have enough time, but we do have to stop. But it's been brilliant. I've really enjoyed it, and thank you for chairing. Thank you for the panel. No problem. I've really learned a lot as well today. Thank you very much to everyone. Jos, Riccardo, Maria, Hayfa, thank you so much for sharing your insights and also opening up
the debate on this topical issue. We thank you a lot.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a
Thank you.
nice